Okay, take it away, Tom.
Well, welcome to our webinar on the life of trees. We're going to start off with a special short movie that goes into pretty considerable depth about the life of trees, and we're going to have to do that a little bit differently today. Jackie's going to show that from her computer, so we gotta do a switcheroo here. So take it away, Jackie.
Okay, can everybody see that?
To see the wizard. Acorns! Look! Acorns!
What do you think you're doing?
Well, we were walking along and we were looking for acorns and... Wait, did you just say something?
Acorns? She was looking for acorns! How would you like it if someone came along and picked up your acorns?
Dear, I keep forgetting we're not in Kansas anymore.
Come along, Dorothy. You don't want any of those acorns.
Are you implying that my acorns aren't what they ought to be?
Oh, no. It's just that she doesn't like little green worms. I'll show you how to get acorns.
And what do you think you're doing?
All
I'm
right.
gonna have to share screen again.
Yep, and don't forget to check the boxes.
Well, I have to be honest with you, that wasn't a completely original skit. Maybe you've seen the movie. I think I saw it about 50 times when I was growing up and liked it every time. So anyway, we're going to talk about the life of trees today. Hold on, we'll get there. There we go.
Hi there. Welcome to our Tom Talk on the life of trees. Got my hands on a white oak right here. There's a bur oak to my left. I'm really in a forest right now, or what we like to call an oak savanna here in the Chicago area. My first interest in trees really wasn't in trees themselves so much as it was the forest. My first experience of the forest, I was about 5 or 6 years old. We lived next to a peanut field in rural Virginia, and I would wander into just the edges of the forest. It was a large, spooky place to me, but it was also interesting looking under logs and looking at the flowers and the trees there. Fast forward about 20 years, and I'm first learning about tree identification. And that's when the diversity of the forest just explodes for me. And first I learned about trees, and then about shrubs, and then about wildflowers, and eventually about birds. So the forest, not just as a dark, spooky place, but as a place of a tremendous diversity of life, becomes a reality for me. But today, I really don't want to talk about identification or tree identification or shrub identification. What I want to talk about is the life of trees. And so trees, like this big white oak, as a living thing and how it functions in and of itself, how it functions as a part of the ecosystem, and really how things like trees evolved over the last few 100 million years into the form that we see them today. So it's the life of trees today. Are you ready? Let's go.
So we're going to talk about a number of things today. I thought I'd just start off with a few points of the kinds of topics we're going to deal with today. First one is trees are interpenetrated by their living and non-living environment. The boundaries of life are much less much more difficult to locate than you think they are. At the body of trees is really shaped to accommodate the exchange of materials and energy with their environment. A tree is both a genetic individual like you and I, but it's also a colony of related genetic individuals, which is a little different than we tend to think about organisms. Trees are sentient, and I mean that really in the sense that they respond to the world around them. It's almost a feature of all life, that it's sensing the world around it and responding to it. And the populations of trees respond to the world when individual trees can't. I mean, any individual organism can respond only within the limitations of their own body, but populations are characterized by properties like diversity, that allow them to survive things that individuals can't.
The boundaries of living things, the boundary between the living thing and its environment seems very clear to you, doesn't it? But if we go down to the size of a single cell, those boundaries get very hard to locate. And if we go down to the size of a water molecule, the boundary disappears altogether.
So I want to start off thinking about the root systems of plants. It's the part of plants we don't see. I mean, if you ask someone to draw a picture of a tree, they'll always draw a picture of the above ground half of the tree, and we pretty much forget about the root systems. I mean, we know they're there. They're shaped much, it's not like not like you can just turn the tree upside down and the roots go down, 50 feet if the top goes up 50 feet, more like the roots go down. Generally, most of the roots only a few feet and then spread out as a large disc in the surface soil, because that's where the water and nutrients are most available. And a few roots will go deeper to find water later in the year. But I want to talk about how the roots of trees, deciding where the root stops and the environment starts is really fairly difficult, because I think basically all of our native trees form mycorrhizae, and mycorrhizae is a cooperative relationship between a fungus and a higher plant. It's neither the fungus nor the plant. The mycorrhizae is the combination of the two, and it involves many species of flowering plants. At least 80% of all the flowering plants in the world that we know of, and as many as 50,000 species of fungi. And mycorrhizae, when mycorrhizae were first discovered early in the 20th century, I believe, as the story goes, they originally thought they must be pathogens. They must be harmful organisms because they were growing into the root. The hyphae were growing into the root. They were forming these things called vesicles or arbuscules inside of the cells of the cortex of the roots, and it seemed like they must be pathogens. But it turned out that the more they looked at mycorrhizae, the more they started to realize it wasn't a pathogenic relationship at all. There's a story that circulates in forestry departments when I was getting my degree back in the 1980s, that they first discovered the necessity of mycorrhizae in some pine trees they were trying to plant, where they were planting on some Caribbean islands that hadn't had any trees on them. Maybe not from the present perspective, a very good thing to do, but that was the object at the time, and they kept planting the trees, and the trees were dying. And it wasn't until they discovered they had to inoculate it with soil from the mainland that the trees would survive, because they were bringing the mycorrhizae with them. And there are several kinds of mycorrhizae. This is called the arbuscular mycorrhizae, and then there are the ectomycorrhizae that form these big hairy socks on the outside of the roots, and each of these kinds of mycorrhizae then have all the fungal filaments all throughout the soil, and those fungal filaments are acting like extra root hairs for the plant, greatly increasing increasing the surface area of contact between the plant and the soil. Putting this other organism in between greatly increases that surface area of contact, so it makes it easier for the plant to extract nutrients and water from the soil. At the same time, the fungus is not an autotroph. It doesn't make its own food, so it's getting carbohydrates from the plant, tree or herbaceous plant. It is feeding on the herbaceous plant. Likewise, it's supplying the herbaceous plant or the tree with water and nutrients. This is only one of the secret underground relationships you find with trees, where the environment and the tree sort of merge together. A pretty redbud tree in your front yard, if you went down below ground, you would see these nodules in which they're inhabited by other organisms called rhizobium bacteria. And the rhizobium bacteria are taking atmospheric nitrogen and turning it into ammonia, which is a form of nitrogen that can be used by the tree. In turn, the rhizobium bacteria, much like the mycorrhizae, are being fed by the tree. And so you have another relationship where these outside organisms, what you think of as the environment, actually become a part of the living thing that's a tree. And it doesn't stop there. Well, Kentucky coffee tree, another legume that forms those relationships. Interestingly, probably the most common we have planted in our city streets is honey locust, and that one doesn't form nodules with rhizobium bacteria. In fact, I'm told, I have no primary experience in the tropics, but I'm told that many tropical legumes also do not form these root nodules, but almost all of our temperate legumes of the temperate flora do form the nodules. But it's not just rhizobium bacteria, it's actually actinomycetes, for another bacteria-like organism that form relationships with another whole group of trees. Among them are alders, like the black alder, which is an introduced species, but our native alder shrubs form these relationships, as do autumn olive, that troublesome invasive. I was just working with Jackie yesterday, and we were moving a lot of autumn olives near Lost Valley Visitor Center. This is another plant that's been invaded by these parts of its environment, actinomycetes, and the combination of the two are doing better than either one separately. But let's get back to the tree itself. If we go out to the twigs, we can see that the tree has to, trees, all living things get vital components from the world around them. So they have, in some ways, they have to seal themselves off, like we have skin. A tree has bark, it has an epidermis on the twig. It has to seal itself off from the outside world, but it also has to open itself up to the outside world because it needs things. Like we need oxygen from the atmosphere. Trees need carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they need water from the soil, and they need oxygen to get into this twig because the twig has living cells in it, and all living cells, plant and animal alike, need oxygen in order to respire, to burn up the sugar solutions, to release energy for the living cell. And so they create these things called lenticels, probably most prominent here on this elderberry twig. And the lenticel is a break in this corky covering, this epidermis, the corky covering of the twig that seals it off nicely from the outside world. And then it opens up these areas where that are full of what are called parenchyma cells, or sometimes called companion cells, very thin-walled cells that allow gas diffusion into the twig because those living cells in the twig need that oxygen. So gas is diffusing into the twig at these lenticel locations. The environment is invading the organism through the lenticel. If we get to the leaf, it even gets more interesting. The leaf, again, is covered by an epidermis. The epidermis then has a hard waxy covering called the cuticle. Some leaves even have a soft wax on top, epicuticular wax, like the bottom of a white oak leaf. And you can see an epidermis on the bottom also. But we know that trees need to absorb carbon dioxide, right? And they're also releasing oxygen through the process of photosynthesis. And so they have to breathe, they have to open themselves up to the outside world. And so they have these little breathing passages called stomates. And so the outside atmosphere then penetrates into the leaf through the stomates, into all these openings inside called the spongy mesophyll. So the what looks like the surface area of the leaf here is actually not the effective surface area. It's this surface area here, just tracing all the way around all of these cells. That's the surface area by which the tree is in contact with the atmosphere, through which it can absorb carbon dioxide, and equally as importantly, excrete oxygen and water. Water moves up through this xylem vessel. If you remember, you're just trying to imagine an oak leaf and all those, the veins of the leaf branching off of that mid vein, taking the water out to all the tissues of the leaf to feed them with water. And that water then evaporates from these mesophyll cells into the atmosphere there, and then works its way out into the outside atmosphere. And that's absolutely essential, because the water coming up the trunk of the tree, coming through this vein, through a side vein, out into these mesophyll, that's a continuous column of water. One molecule is attached to another all the way back into this xylem vessel, all the way down the tree, through the trunk, into the root, out through the branches of the root, out into the finest root branches, out into the mycorrhizae, all through the mycorrhizae, all the way out to the soil. One water molecule is attached to another all the way. So it's like a long string. And as the water leaves this mesophyll cell, it exerts a tension that pulls water all the way up. It sounds like a crazy story, but it pulls water all the way up through this system of veins and vessel elements in the trunk, all the way down into the roots, out through the mycorrhizae, pulls it out of the boundary layers of soil particles where that water is sitting. So that loss of water is absolutely essential to the life of the tree. Too much water loss without enough coming in, of course, can be fatal to the tree. It can dehydrate. But the water movement through the tree is what allows the tree to move nutrients from the soil up into the leaves. Fascinating story, and it's all brought about, or the last stage in it occurs in this spongy mesophyll, where the tree invites the outside world into the leaf and exchanges materials with it as a part of the life of the tree.
Hey, Tom, we got a question.
Go ahead.
Can you go back to that leaf picture?
Okay.
So the question was, can you just explain what that cross section is? Which way are you looking at the leaf?
This is the top of the leaf here. This is a cross section through a leaf. I don't know what species of leaf it is, but there's the top of the leaf. This is the bottom of the leaf. This is would be the mid vein of the leaf here. Usually the stomates are located on the bottoms of leaves, probably because the upper surface is being heated by the sun's rays, and so you're creating a very hot boundary layer of air that would maybe draw water out of the leaf too quickly. And so the stomates are generally clustered on the underside of the leaf. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
This is just another drawing of a leaf showing the spongy mesophyll, the palisade layer up here where most of the photosynthesis is taking place. Once you're out of the leaf, you're really, there's this series of zones. You think of, there's clearly an inside and an outside, but this boundary layer of air is distinctly different from the air, what they're called the bulk air here, the atmosphere within the crown of the tree, because it's held close to the leaf. The surface friction with the leaf slows the air down. It's therefore more humid. As the water's evaporating, it's cooling this boundary layer of air. So you have a cool, moist layer of air, distinctly different from the air outside of that. And again, a step different from the air that's in the mesophyll of the leaf. As we then move away from the leaf and inside of the crown of the tree, again, you have this part of the atmosphere is distinctly different from the atmosphere 100 feet above the trees, because it's so influenced by the water leaving through the water and oxygen leaving through the stomates of the leaves out into this area. This is much cooler and moister. Likewise, in the forest, it's a cool and moist environment, much more so than the world outside of it. So having done some microclimate studies in the past, if in the summertime, if you put a max min thermometer inside of a forest, it will be sometimes 5 to 10 degrees cooler during the heat of the day inside of the forest as opposed to outside in the meadow. Likewise, at night, it will be warmer. Now, why would it be warmer at night? Why would it be warmer at night? Why would a forest be warmer at night? Well, what happens is that in the daytime, this is particularly noticeable in the winter when the leaves are down. In the daytime, the architecture of the forest, all these woody components sticking up into the air, are absorbing the sun's energy. And at night, they're re-radiating that energy as heat, and so warming that layer of air that's in the forest. So the forest itself is distinctly different microenvironment from the world outside of the forest. The whole idea of insides and outsides is really harder and harder to locate when you start looking in detail at life. It's thoroughly interpenetrated by the environment, and the influences of organisms transform the environment around them into something distinctly different. Are we any different? Well, not really, because if you look at really any animal, just talk about mammals like human beings, it would seem like we're totally different because I've got relatively few body parts, not thousands of twigs. I only have 10 fingers and 10 toes. So it seemed like I'm operating according to different rules, but that's not really the case. We have to invite the environment inside of us. That's what happens when we eat. When we drink a glass of water, the water goes down the throat. Now it's inside of me. The environment is inside of me. When I eat a hot dog, it goes inside of me, and then it's broken down. It gets into the circulatory system. It moves throughout the body. It sort of looks like a tree, doesn't it? It's this branching structures. What is happening is that we're trying to maximize our surface area of contact with the outside world. So we bring the outside world inside of us, break it down into little components, and then circulate it all throughout our bodies. And we end up, we're more or less a tree turned inside out. Basically, we have the same limitations as a tree. We have to open ourselves up to the outside world in order to live, because we have to get food and oxygen from the outside world, as a tree needs to get carbon dioxide, nutrients, and water from the outside world. Each of us can do that only by opening ourselves up and by maximizing that surface area of contact.
You know, there's one version of evolutionary theory that describes evolution as an arms race, so that every species is trying to get bigger and faster to catch members of another species and eat it, or that other species is trying to be able to run faster to avoid the predatory species that plants and animals just locked into this deadly competition, and the bigger and the faster and the stronger always win. But trees pose an interesting problem for that simple and maybe simplistic version of evolutionary theory. If you think about trees, this Hills oak could live hundreds of years, and yet it has to defend itself against insects that can go through several life cycles in the same year. And it would seem like evolution by natural selection would work so much faster on the little insects to get around any defense the tree had, that it wouldn't be a fair fight, and trees would be routinely stripped by insects every year. So how is it that trees, so slow reproducing, seems like big lumbering creatures, how do they keep up against those tiny, tiny little insects?
Good question, Tom. So how do they do that? Well, let's go through a few sort of standard ways in which trees try to make more of themselves. That's the definition of Darwinian fitness, is creating more viable offspring. How do they do that in a world full of hungry creatures? Well, you could go through the strategy of the cottonwood tree. Just grow fast, flower young, and make lots and lots of seeds. So something has got to find there's got to be, some of those seeds will germinate and grow, and despite the fact that a lot of them may die and be eaten, some of them will make it through and produce more seeds. So that's one strategy. Just grow fast, grow, flower young, and make lots of seed. Or you can do just kind of the opposite, and trees take this strategy too, and that is you grow very, very old. And the only way to grow very, very old is grow very, very slowly. And often to grow in places that are very difficult environments, which limit the number of competitors and predators. Bristlecone pine is a prime example of that up very near the tree line out in the Rockies. Or more familiar northern white cedar here in southern Ontario, growing a dolomite bedrock, I think in the St. Lawrence River Valley, because they're growing in such difficult environment. They grow very, very slowly and live for a very, very long period of time. Or we could take a more common sense approach, I think, in the way we think about defending ourselves against predators. We could do what willows and black cherries and ironwoods do, and that is we pack our leaves with secondary chemicals that just taste bad or are poisonous to predators. That's a strategy. It seems to relatively common in the plant world. We could cover ourselves with thorns, probably more effective with mammalian predators than with insects, but there's some evidence actually that very prickly plants actually slow down the movement of caterpillars, and that for a long time we thought all prickles and thorns on plants must be to defend them against mammals, but it turns out that at least some plants may actually be, when they're covered with very small prickles, using that against caterpillars. So on that note, I just wanted to go through this, that you know what these prickles, spines, and thorns are about. Multiflora rose, I don't know if you may have your camera on, I have a big scratch on the side of my face here from multiflora rose that got me yesterday. So, and that's probably one drop out of 20 gallons of blood I've shed to multiflora rose over the years. Prickles are modified hairs like this white birch. Hairs just grow out of the epidermis of the twig. And here you can see with this bristly rose, as opposed to the multiflora, that these start to look more and more like hairs. They're just outgrowth of epidermal cells. With spines like a black locust, where you have these paired spines, I did a woody plant workshop or a tree ID workshop indoors in person a couple of weeks ago. And we looked at a black locust twig. I think we had a prickly ash twig there. Maybe we just had pictures of them. But these spines that are paired right at the node where a leaf attached. Same with both of them, paired spines. These are called spines, and they're different from prickles because they're actually a modified stipule. Here's a black willow with little leafy growths on either side where the leaf attaches right at a node. And because the thorns are right at nodes and on either side of where a leaf used to attach, we know these are modified stipules rather than being modified hairs. Whereas thorns like honey locust, these huge branch thorns, and the honey locust you have growing along city streets doesn't have any thorns, it's a thornless variety. But if you encounter honey locust growing along rivers and streams, it will have these big balls of branch thorns. Hawthorns also have these generally unbranched, sometimes branched, but generally unbranched, needle sharp thorns. These are modified twigs or modified branches that become thorns. So modified hairs, modified stipules, and modified branches, all ways in which plants, trees in this case, or shrubs are interacting with and defending themselves against the outside world and predators. But all of those really sort of don't get to the grist of the criticism I started with here, and that is trees just seem to reproduce so slowly that any defense, any thorn or prickle or toxic chemical would only work for a while, and insects would evolve a defense. But it turns out that trees aren't quite, actually have ways of evolving much, much more fast than you think they are. Researchers at the University of British Columbia found that in a single large Sitka spruce, a single old tree had 100,000 genetic differences in the DNA sequences. And what that means is that mutations have happened as the tree grew. A mutation can happen anytime DNA is copied, and that happens anytime one cell splits apart and makes two cells, the process of mitosis. It's essential to plant growth. So as a plant grows, in this case a tree, there is always the chance of a mistake in transcription of the DNA which is a mutation. It creates a different allele for that gene, and most mutations are bad, but occasionally mutations may be useful, and so the plant is accumulating these mutations as it grows. And if a branch grows out from a mutated twig, every flower or cone that's grows out of that twig carries that mutation. And so the seeds that are produced on that branch are slightly different from the seeds that are produced on other branches. If that branch is more resistant to insect predators because of some characteristic in its cell chemistry, that mutation is then given to all of the seed that's created by that branch. So even though the tree, and this Sitka spruce can grow several thousand years, even if the tree can grow many years, it actually is creating mutations and going through this process of mutation and reproduction on a much faster time interval, allowing it to adapt to, in particular, fast-growing predators like insects. Fascinating thing. You just wouldn't expect that when you look at a big tree. It just looks so static and stable that it's each spring it's growing out, it's creating new genetic individuals.
Hi there. This is a willow tree, probably the weeping willow or Salix alba. And the reason we're looking at this now is because this tree is either male or it's female. It has to be one or the other. Willows and cottonwoods, ash trees, box elder. We have a whole set of trees that are either male or female, and what that does is it means that pollen produced by one individual has to move to a female individual of the same species. They have to exchange genetic information every time they reproduce between individuals. Now, oak trees accomplish the same thing but differently. So an oak tree has both male flowers and female flowers on the same tree, but the male pollen is produced before the female is receptive, so that minimizes the chance of self-pollination. So my basic question is, why do trees do that? What is this busy work all about? Because it would be so much simpler to have a male and female flower on the same tree next to one another, and the male flower pollinates the female flower. That's simple, it's close by, you need to produce much less pollen. So why don't trees do that? Or for that matter, why doesn't an oak tree just create an acorn just like it creates a leaf or a twig? Genetically identical to itself. Why does it go through the busy work of sexual reproduction? So that's what we want to talk about today. Why do trees go through all that busy work of sexual reproduction?
I remember running into this question, not in a class, but I was actually teaching at the Morton Arboretum very early on, so it's probably 1990, and just bumped into this. We were all told that the variety created by sexual reproduction, like all of us, are different. As individuals, we're all different from one another, and there, I don't know, was it 7 billion people in the world today? I've lost track. And they're all different from one another, and every oak tree is different from one another. That's the difference between individuals. And I can remember it. I don't remember exactly when I was told it, just sort of thinking that was the variation that evolution was working, was the variation between individuals, but that's not really true. If we look at here's reproduction, and we're looking at the frequency of genes, and you can define evolution as really a change in gene frequencies over the generations. You know, if in one of the previous examples, if cottonwood evolves a new secondary chemical that slows down a certain insect larvae that's been eating a lot of cottonwood leaves, that allele or gene for that new chemical will become more and more common in the cottonwood population over time, because it gives the trees which have it a way to defend themselves against this hungry creature. But if there is no selective advantage, the gene frequencies stay pretty much the same. It's called the Hardy-Weinberg principle, that if you have no selection, gene frequencies just more or less stay the same. In this example, it's about 50-50 for the X, the capital Y, the small y gene. And most of these examples don't use trees because geneticists rarely are working with trees, or working with fruit flies and annual plants. In this case, we're starting off with brown mice and black mice, and they both have this, they're the allele for black color and the allele for brown color are equal at 50%, but over time the foxes keep eating the black mice, and so it's the brown mice that survive, and there's 90% and only 10% of the dark alleles left. So that's evolution by natural selection. It's a change in gene frequencies over time. It's really eliminating. It's really, here's a population that has 50-50. This one is headed toward all big A and no little I. So actually the genetic diversity is going down. That's what selection does, is it picks out what's called the deleterious genes, or call them bad genes. It's picking those out, eliminating them, lowering genetic diversity. But it's mutation that increases genetic diversity, that creates more genes. It's not sexual reproduction. It's mutation that increases genetic diversity by making new variations of genes, and selection that then reduces that genetic diversity by getting rid of the deleterious genes. And sexual selection really plays this rather curious role of just mixing and matching everything with every generation. It's not creating anything new. It's just mixing and matching. If you go through, we're not going to go through all the steps in sexual reproduction and crossing over and in meiosis that go to just all this incredible genetic busywork trying to come up with just new combinations, not any new genes at all. So evolution is a change in gene frequencies, but sexual reproduction is just a mixing and matching of genes with each generation. So the question is, why go to all that bother? I mean, you could have evolution in a clonal organism. All the organisms, if one, if a tree is growing and one branch has a new mutation that makes it more susceptible to spongy moths that are eating all the leaves, then that one isn't going to make any flowers. It's not going to make any seeds, and so that new gene just drops out. So you don't need sexual reproduction to have selection. So why all these flowers and the incredible genetic busywork of sexual reproduction if it's not really necessary for evolution? Well, this is a picture of climate change over a very long period of time, the last 500 million years. So we've got, this is the Pleistocene, this most recent drop into very cold temperatures. So we've had periods of much higher temperatures than at present back 50 million years ago, 100 million years ago, 250 million years ago, periods when there was absolutely no ice on the earth anywhere. And the present, in relation to that, the present temperatures are somewhat or cooler. So any organism that evolves along the way has to be able, it's the lineage of that organism has to be able to survive all these ups and downs in order to be present today. So a species that is perfectly adapted to some uniform warm temperatures is then perfectly ill-adapted if the climate turns cold, and all of the individuals die. So to be perfectly adapted, we have each organism in your population to be perfectly adapted to this warm temperature, but if it gets colder, they all die. Whereas if you have some of your individuals are ill-adapted to the old way, but when the world changes, suddenly those what were ill-adapted before become well adapted to the present, so that having variety in a population, the individual isn't variable, it's the population. Having variety in the population allows you to survive crises in the history of life. And if we look at the history of life in the graph on the left-hand side, these are changes in the number of families of living creatures, and you can see the ups and downs here. And this is families. If we were looking at changes in the number of species, it's estimated here at the end of the Permian, as many as 90% of the species of life on Earth disappeared in a short period of time. So anything that was alive back here that couldn't make it through that choke point left no descendants and is not present in the world today. So the ability to survive these crises is critical if your genetic lineage is going to make it through. And so this sexual reproduction, just creating all this wild, crazy variety of things, some of which don't seem very well adapted at all, but that crazy variety may be critically important if circumstances change dramatically in the future. We just went through an ice age, less than 20,000 years ago, dramatic change in circumstances that would have taken plants that were well adapted before the ice age and put them under extreme stress to survive, or to be able to move out of the way of that coming cold.
Now that I've convinced you about the importance of sexual reproduction, I want to let you in on a not very well kept secret, and that is that many trees, if not most, have figured out ways to reproduce without exchanging gametes between trees. Take this aspen tree, for example, or this one over here. What look like individual trees are actually connected below ground by a common root system. And you've got maybe close to 100 stems of aspen coming up here, all coming off of the same root system. And so the question is, are these two trees or one tree? And what is the boundary between growth, which we can understand, or reproduction? And clonal organisms really make you think about that boundary.
Hey, Tom, we had a question.
Okay.
So with trees with only male and female, it would be possible as climate change occurs, or would it be possible to take a tree with characteristics that occur in one climate type and merge them with a tree from another climate type for survival?
I mean, this is humans. I mean, sort of crossbreeding trees between, I mean, you can certainly do that. These are all, there are a lot of, I mean, scientists are looking at a lot of extreme scenarios about climate change and the magnitude of climate change and what may or may not need to be done, including assisted migration of trees. Your suggestion is bringing sort of the genes northward. We could, bring the pollen of Central Illinois white oaks and then pollinate white oaks in our area to get at least some of those more warm adapted genes. All these things are possible. To go much farther than that is to sort of maybe go into what might be a future Tom talk about how we're going to respond to climate change, or how we're going to get ready for it, respond to it. What are the priorities? What are we actually trying to accomplish in conservation? There's a lot of important questions there, but you're right. That's one of the ways that we could do it. And that is to bring, rather than to bring the whole tree or acorns from Central Illinois, you could just bring the pollen, which is, I guess, would be fairly easy to gather and transport, and then just pollinate trees, white oaks in our area, and that would at least move some of those warm adapted genes northward. Okay. So after convincing you that sexual reproduction is so important to the life, not just of plants, but really of all higher organisms, large plants and animals. Almost to a species retain the ability, at least occasionally, to undergo sexual reproduction. And yet, with plants, they hedge their bets. And many plants, I'm not sure all of them do, but it seems like each year we learn more about plants and what they're doing that at first we didn't know they were doing. They have ways to clone themselves, meaning they can create more individuals like that are genetically identical to the parent plant. So an interesting way, black spruce, in the winter, the snow forces the lower branches down into the peat moss, and those lower branches then start to grow roots, and new trees are growing up that are genetically identical to the old tree. So this is called layering. I mean, we don't see it. We plant lots of spruce, very black spruce. I've seen it planted as an ornamental only once, and it didn't do very well. And I have no doubt that layering would be impossible in a dry land environment anyway. But it's not uncommon when you see black spruce growing in bogs. It's like a tamarack tree right behind it there.
Hey, Tom, we had a question.
Yep.
Are aspens parts evolving like the Sitka spruce is doing, or are their life cycles too short
No,
to evolve?
that's exactly right. An aspen, the biggest aspen clone out west, I think it was called the Pando clone. It's like 100 acres in size. And so as that aspen clone expands, anytime a plant is growing, it has to create more cells. The cells don't just get bigger and bigger. The cells have to reproduce and create more cells. And so that process is called mitosis, and it happens every spring at the growing tip of a plant. The little buds you see at the tips of trees, twigs now will break dormancy. And inside of that, as it starts to grow, the process of mitosis is creating more cells as that twig expands. And that requires creating more cells, requires creating more DNA. Anytime you're doing replication of DNA, you can have mistakes in transcription, new genes created. And so that's happening in the expansion of an aspen clone as it is at the tips of an oak tree as it grows. So all the acorns that fall from a big oak tree are not genetically identical to one another, even though they belong to the same individual. Now, obviously, these are small changes, but they are changes nonetheless. And then an aspen clone, or my advisor at the University of Michigan, Dr. Barnes, from whom I learned an incredible amount, was an expert on aspen and would go west every summer and would collect cuttings of aspen and have the genetics done on them, and talked about the variety that you could walk through the aspen clone and see where a new genetic type had started, and you can see changes in the leaf, some leaf morphology or color related to those mutations. So layering in black spruce is one way of doing it. We talked root collar sprouts are generally thought of as a means of cloning. Is this cloning or is it growth? It's hard to say. It's a response to damage. Generally, you damage the above ground part of the root collar buds, dormant buds that are at right where the root and shoot join together are dormant buds under the bark. Those break dormancy and start to grow. The buds are held dormant by hormones created in the leaves of the tree, generally called auxins. I think it's really a class of hormones. And as those circulate throughout the plant, they hold these buds dormant at the root collar. When you damage the top of the tree, cut it off, that removes the supply of hormones. Those buds break dormancy, much to our chagrin when we're trying to control buckthorn or autumn olive or multiflora rose. You can cut it down and it just comes back over and over and over and over again, essentially reproducing itself on the spot from those root collar sprouts. American basswood is one of the unusual trees that will root collar sprout even when it's not damaged. And so one stem becomes many stems. Talked about aspens before. Beech can do the same. things. And when you're walking in a beech maple wood, a lot of those young beech trees are not necessarily produced by beech nuts germinating and growing from the ground. They may be coming off in the root system of established trees. White poplar is a not super common invasive, but you do see it because it was planted near used to be planted a lot near homes 100, 200 or 150 years ago. So white poplars, when you find them, are often marking an old homestead. And if you cut down the white poplar, the root system dramatic responds by just sending up shoots everywhere. So very aggressive root clonal organisms. Black locust does it very aggressively. It's a problem invasive. It will do this even when the larger tree is not damaged. But in my experience, you can't control these sprouts coming off the root until you cut and kill the large tree that's producing them, or they'll just create more and more and more sprouts in the future. So it's a way that trees are making more of themselves. They're creating offspring in a sense, but without sexual reproduction. Hawthorns really defy logic here. They create these flowers and they look like beautiful, just like an apple flower or a hawthorn flower, 5-petal white flowers in the rose family with sepals and petals and stamens and a pistil and all those things that you need in a sexually reproducing flower. And yet, when the embryo forms, it grows out from the seed coat rather than growing from the fertilized egg inside of the ovary. It's an outshoot of an outgrowth of the seed coat, and the seed coat is parent tissue. And so the embryo in a hawthorn, I think they're called pomes, or I think they're somewhere between a pome and a drupe. The embryo inside of the several seeds that are inside of this hawthorn pome will be genetically identical to the parent plant, or at least to that branch of the parent plant. Again, it creates this structure that looks like a sexually reproducing plant, and then it clones itself with these seeds. Actually, dandelions are doing the same thing in your front yard. If you've ever noticed dandelions when they're growing, the first ones that come up in the spring seem to stay in flower longer. I suspect, I don't know, I suspect those are actually reproducing sexually, because they remain in flower for a number of days before they close up and then open and create that big white ball of seeds. But the dandelions later in the year will open up one day, close up the next day, and create seeds the day after that. They're open for almost no period of time. They're not, in fact, pollinated at all. They're undergoing seed apomixis, and the seeds they're creating are genetically identical to the parent plant. So this seed apomixis is I don't know, there probably are a number of other plants that at least do that part of the time, creating. And for hawthorns, interestingly, if you're just a student of trees as I am and love old tree books, if you look at some old tree books, they have many, many more species of hawthorn in them than we recognize today, because botanists didn't know quite what to do with hawthorns. I mean, you have whole populations that are really descended from a single individual. So they're slightly different from a similar population nearby, but they're distinctly different because maybe they have more hair on the leaves or less hair, or the fruits are slightly larger than the population next to them. So normally when we see a population as a slight difference from another population, we either label it a subspecies or recognize it as a species level difference. But with hawthorns, maybe they're just two individual trees of the same downy hawthorn that they're slightly different, but they're just two populations of the same species. So today taxonomists have become more conservative, and they'll lump together these clones in the same species. But if they're not interbreeding with one another, they're sort of violating. Our whole species concept is based on the exchange of genetic material within a population of organisms. And populations that are undergoing seed apomixis really aren't exchanging genes. And so we can call them a species, but in some sense, they really violate the species concept. maybe a bit of a digression, but I find it fascinating when every time I see a hawthorn, I think about that.
Hey, Tom, we had a question.
Sure.
Not necessarily related to the hawthorns, but if water moves up through a tree in response to water loss from the leaves, what causes the water or sap to rise in maple trees in midwinter?
The rising of the sap, and this is not something I've studied, but the rising of the sap is so back up a step. Water moves upward in a tree almost entirely. It's called transpiration pull. It's a physical mechanism. Water evaporates from the leaves. Transpiration pull pulls, literally that column of water pulls water up through the tree, and that pull goes all the way out to the mycorrhizae into the water films on soil particles. The movement of sap upward in trees in the springtime is powered through the phloem tissue that's moving sap upward in the tree. Now, there is some root pressure in the xylem, the water carrying tissue, and there is movement of sugars upward in the phloem tissue. Beyond that, I can't answer the question because I really haven't studied it, but that movement of sap upward in the springtime is powered by the tree, by the consumption of stored sugars. So the tree is powering that movement of sap upward in the tree. It's not a transpiration pull as you find with water transport up the tree later in the season once the leaves have come out. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, another means of cloning. There's so many means by which plants clone themselves. Why do they go through the bother of sexual reproduction at all if they clone themselves so easily? Willows, at least most species of willows, can fragment. So twigs can break off. They lodge in the mud and they'll just start growing into another willow tree. That's especially handy for plants that grow along rivers and streams, obviously, because of the proximity of the water and the sediment deposited along rivers and streams at times of flood. So another means, even has a fancy name, cladoptosis. That's a hard one for me to pronounce. Cladoptosis. That fragmentation of willow trees. Cottonwoods can do it to a minor extent. Usually you can propagate cottonwoods from cuttings, but usually you have to add some plant hormones to get them to root aggressively. These are not trees, but there are more ways that plants can clone themselves. I don't have any personal experience with piggyback plants and mother thousands, but in both cases, what you have are little plants that start to grow semi-independently on the parent plant and can then fall off and start growing on their own. We do have bulblet fern growing in our flora. I see it not uncommonly anytime I visit. I see bulblet fern more often when I visit areas with bedrock outcrops like Starved Rock State Park or those areas. You do see it occasionally growing in the woods, but more often you have a close relative, fragile fern, Cystopteris bulbifera, that doesn't have the bulblets. So these bulblets, when you slide your fingers along, they break off. They're probably about 1/8 to 3/16 of an inch in size, little green balls. And this is just a ball of tissue created by the parent fern. And when it falls off, it can germinate in a sense like a seed can germinate, only this isn't a seed. It's just a little ball of tissue, and it will start growing and create roots and above ground parts identical to the parent bulblet fern. So this is bypassing the whole sexual reproduction cycle of a fern, where the fern is creating a spore. The spore is dispersed, it grows, it creates a gametophyte that produces sperm and eggs. The sperm fertilizes the eggs, and the sporophyte, the fern that you think that you see, grows out of that fertilized gametophyte. So it bypasses all that and just creates another bulblet fern out of these little bulblets, or gemmy as they're sometimes called. So plants have found all these ways of bypassing sexual reproduction. So it's really not necessary for more making. I mean, it's if you are really a nerd like me and you start going online and you start looking at evolutionary biologists that have puzzled over this question, It remains a question of why plants go. This comes at a huge cost to the plant, because the individual plant, if I'm an oak tree and I can make an acorn that's genetically identical to myself, then I'm passing on 100% of my genes to the next generation. Sort of in a Darwinian sense, that would seem to be a great advantage. I'm passing on 100% of my genes to the next generation. If I sexually reproduce, I'm only passing on 50%. And so it comes at a huge genetic cost, and yet it's almost universal amongst higher plants and animals. Fascinating question. It has not been fully answered. Yeah, I love that part about studying biology and ecology, the fact that you run into these questions that still puzzle people today.
What do you think you're doing?
Pushing on this tree and trying to move it.
How's that going for you?
Not good at all. I thought it would move. I mean, you know, oak trees, the glaciers were here just 18,000 years ago, and there were no oak trees here when there were glaciers, and oak trees at that time were like hundreds of miles to the south. How did they get here if they can't move? I don't understand.
Indeed, good question. A woman named Margaret Davis, I had the opportunity to meet. I worked in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan as a graduate student. It was right around here back in the 1980s, and I got to meet my advisor was Bert Barnes from the University of Michigan. So, but I met her on a field trip here with her students, and they were studying. What they do is they study fossil pollen, and so if you look in wetlands or lakes or ponds that have been around since glaciers retreated from the area, you find sediments, and all the trees around there, at least particularly the wind pollinated trees, produce massive amounts of pollen, and those fall into the lake and they are buried in the sediments. And so you can go down into those sediments today and find that fossil pollen and identify it at least to genus, sometimes to species. And so you know that there were plants in the vicinity contributing pollen to that lake. And then you carbon date the sediment, and then you know the time that the pollen was put into there. And so if you do that over much of the eastern United States, you can find when, for instance, white pine was expanding northward, it reached about halfway up the lower peninsula of Michigan by 10,000 years ago. By 8,000 years ago, it was just north of the Chicago area through most of Wisconsin. And about 5,000 years ago, it had reached northwest of Lake Superior. So even though we see it there today and we think of this as the far north and these trees have always been there, they haven't. They had to leave during the height of the Pleistocene. They've only been back there for a few thousand years. Here's oaks. Oaks reached our area, according to Dr. Davis and her students, probably around somewhere between 10 and 12,000 years ago. Before that, there were no oaks here. So oaks are coming into the region right around the time of the dramatically warming climate, around 10 to 11,000 years ago. But trees can't move. We know that they're rooted into the ground. So how do trees move? In fact, more recent research has found a rate of movement somewhere around 19 to 25 kilometers or 11 to 15 miles a century. Now that seems awfully slow, doesn't it? 15 miles a century. But if you think about this for a moment, a century, well, how many generations of an oak tree is a century? I mean, really pushing it, maybe 20 years, you'll start to develop with any consistency, oak trees will start to develop some acorns. They're really not going to produce lots of acorns until maybe 50 years. But that's only 5 generations. 5 generations to go 11 miles. I mean, that's some pretty fast dispersal, really. How do they do that? Well, let's look at tree dispersal. These are common ways that we know trees disperse seeds. Bird dispersal is probably the most the fastest dispersal for the obvious reason that birds can fly fairly rapidly, and so they're eating these small, tasty seeds. I mean, many of our invasive shrubs like honeysuckle and buckthorn and autumn olive have small berry-like fruits that are eaten by birds and widely dispersed, and they can invade very rapidly, very large areas very rapidly. Wind dispersed seeds like box elder and white ash and Siberian elm have a shorter dispersal distance. Generally, most of that seed is going to fall within a few hundred feet of the tree. Maybe in real gusts, it could go twice that, but not nearly as far as a bird can carry it. So if you look at, I mean, I remember doing this in classes at the Morton Arboretum many years ago, looking at this big field, open field on the north side of the, or the east side of the Arboretum called Big Rock Field, and looking at the plants that had invaded along the edge and then going all the way out into the middle. And at least at that time, and this would have been early 90s, the oaks were all right along the edge. They were within, almost all the oaks were within 100 feet of the edge, really about as far as squirrels would bother to take acorns into the field. You saw wind dispersed plants go much further into the field, but again, they dropped out, and it was mostly bird dispersed woody plants that had colonized the interior of the field. And here are nut dispersed plants can sometimes have longer distance to dispersal with blue jays. For some of the smaller oak seeds, it's unknown really the role jays play with some of these larger oak acorns, and particularly shagbark hickories and put an invasive in here, sawtooth oak, are really dependent on mammals for their dispersal, and so that's those are pretty short dispersal distances. I mean, most squirrel dispersal is going to happen within 100 feet of the parent plant, most of it anyway. And we can have large animal dispersal of these seeds. Honey locust, we don't think of honey locust in coffee trees, Kentucky coffee trees looking especially delicious, but the pulp is actually quite sweet, and large animals will eat the pods and then excrete in their dung the pods. In other places, I've seen honey locust seeds in deer scat many times if they're honey locusts growing nearby. Osage orange, which is it's not really a serious invasive in our region, but it can be. It was brought in by farmers for fence rows because it has razor sharp thorns. Cattle will eat these big softball sized fruits, and old cattle pastures can be full of Osage orange trees. So again, these are fairly short distance means of dispersal, but dispersal nonetheless. I mean, dispersal is critical to the life of every single plant. And I want to emphasize that because it would make sense that a tree is growing, and if a tree is growing in a spot, it must be a good spot for the tree to grow because it's already growing there. So why not just drop all of your seeds right there in the immediate vicinity, because that's a good spot. If you disperse it in any distance, you could be dispersing it into highways and roads and ball fields where people are mowing, or into dry gravelly places or dry sandy places, or into the water where you can't grow. So why not just drop all your seeds where it's a good spot? Well, that would work for a long time, but eventually wherever you're growing is going to become a bad spot. Eventually the climate is going to change. And so wherever you're growing, you need to be able to get away from there. So dispersal is absolutely essential for long-term survival. And I'm talking about long-term, over thousands of years, for populations to survive. That ability to disperse and move is absolutely critical. And the only things we have growing around us today are the things that could survive the ice age, and their progenitors before that, escaping all of the climatic and other crises in the world before that. Those are the only things we have around us living in the world today, are things that could escape those big problems.
It's winter now, and plants like this goldenrod are alive underground. It looks like it's dead because the above ground part is dead, but the underground part, the perinating organ we call it, the root, stays alive from year to year. That's why we call it a perennial plant. So it survives the winter as a living plant below the ground. Plants like this evening primrose are biennial. So this one got to its second year of growth last summer, and now it's alive only as seed under the snow and on the ground. So these plants can kind of avoid having a living part of the plant above ground. They're either living below ground as a root system, or they're living as seed under the snow. But trees like this burl don't have that luxury. So they have all of these living parts left above the surface, where those twig temperatures are going to fall even below zero, much less below freezing. So living things are really in danger. If ice forms in the cells, it ruptures the cell membranes, and that part of the plant dies. So trees go through a lot of physiological changes in the fall, readying themselves for winter. Each cell has a sack of water inside it in a little membrane bound organelle called a vacuole. And in the fall, they take that big vacuole and they break it up into lots and lots of little vacuoles, and they pump extra sugars and salts in there, and that lowers the freezing temperature. So they're trying to get ready for winter. The roots aren't in quite the danger. So deeper roots aren't going to freeze. The shallow roots will freeze and then thaw and then freeze and then thaw. And so the roots have a way of winter-proofing themselves enough so they're not damaged by the freeze, but they're able to grow slowly in the winter when the ground thaws. So that's how a tree gets through winter. But in any event, with all these plants, when the spring comes in warmer weather, that's when plants really start to move.
So let's look at some of those plant movements. When I couldn't help myself. They're not doing it when you're not looking. They're doing it when you're looking too. This is not a tree. This is kudzu vine in the south. As I was doing this, I was just powerfully reminded of this moment when I was doing research in pine plantations in Alabama, looking at the soils and growth characteristics of the pine plantations and trying to understand which soils would grow loblolly pine trees faster than which other soils. So I was driving around rural Alabama from one farm pine plantation to another, and the kudzu would start growing in, particularly on the really narrow lanes that weren't frequented by cars very often, and you would find the kudzu growing in from both sides of the road, and it was only right in the center of the road that was clear of the kudzu vines. And I found myself in my Auburn University pickup truck driving right down the middle of the road to try to, it was as if I was being attacked by this kudzu vine from both sides, because what the kudzu vine was doing is what trees do, and that is it was growing toward resources, and it's harvesting sunlight. In this case, it's growing out into this opening of the road, harvesting sunlight. Trees explore space as they grow, and they gather sunlight, water, and nutrients. I mean, the upper parts are growing typically towards sunlight in the opposite direction of the gravitational pull. The roots are growing away from sunlight. If roots in the soil, the fine roots are growing up very near the surface, but when they get too near the surface, the sunlight tells them to go back down again. And the gravitational pull, the roots are growing in the direction of the gravitational pull more often than not. In wetlands, they can sometimes grow upward because they need oxygen. One of the limiting factors of root growth, tree root growth in wetlands is oxygen, as opposed to trees in dryland environments. The limiting factor is water, but in wetlands, the limiting factor is oxygen. So the roots will actually grow up right toward the surface in order to harvest any oxygen that's diffusing into the surface soil from the atmosphere above. So trees are responding to the world as they grow. Like these pine trees here, if you plant a red pine in your yard, it's probably not a preferred species for city planting, but if you have a sandy soil, it'll probably grow okay here. But if you let it grow in the sunlight like this, as the tree is growing up, it has side branches, and as long as those side branches are being fed by sunlight, they'll stay on the tree. The branch is doing some useful work for the tree. It's producing it's producing sugars, conducting photosynthesis, and so the branch stays on the tree. The lowest branches are in enough shade that they just fall off, and you have a clean bowl to the tree here in this lower half of the crown. Planted in a plantation setting like this, very quickly the shade toward the bottom of the trunk or bowl of the tree is such that the branches no longer do the tree any good. They're just shed very quickly, and the only part of the tree that has branches with needles on them is right up at the top of the bowl of the tree. I mean, this is good for foresters because that tree tends to then add cellulose layers of wood uniformly from the base of the live crown all the way to the base, creating this nice columnar structure that you can then cut and saw into boards. But from the tree's point of view, what it's doing is clustering its photosynthesis at the top, where it can harvest sunlight and carbon dioxide as its roots are spreading below ground to harvest water and nutrients. So dramatically different forms just based on the environment in which you grow the same red pine plant. But we also have differences in form between different species. And here are two species of oak that have really very different growing forms. The excurrent form has a very strong central leader. And what's happening here is that this leader of the tree, the terminal bud here, is creating one of the auxin hormones that are then suppressing or slowing the growth of lateral branches below it. So the tree's growth tends to have a very strong central trunk, relatively smaller side branches, and you create this sort of pyramidal, almost Christmas tree-like growth form, often on a pin oak, even grown in the open where it's getting plenty of sunlight to the branches. A bur oak tree, on the other hand, has very little apical dominance, and once it grows up, it's shed these lowermost branches that just simply weren't getting enough sunlight. But other than that, it has a growth form that's really very different from a shrub you might grow in front of your house, like a cotoneaster shrub in front of your house has a growth form that looks an awful lot like a bur oak tree, just big, wide spreading branches. It's growing out, harvesting sunlight in all directions because it's available. But people can take advantage of these same characteristics and manipulate the genetics of plants. I don't know exactly how plant breeders do it, but the English oak, while the bark is quite different from a bur oak tree, its leaves are very, well, certainly in the same family resemblance, leaves to a bur oak tree. But horticulturalists have been able to create these fastigiate, it's the fancy word for these tall, narrow trees. They can create a fastigiate bur oak. I'll let you in on a little secret here. I look at this and I feel like the tree is being tortured. I don't like these because I've been to England and I know what an English oak is supposed to look like, and these just look like tortured trees to me. But nevertheless, horticulturalists love variety, and so they created from this very decurrent species, they've created this fastigiate or excurrent growth form.
Hey, Tom.
Yep.
Two questions in the chat. One is from a little bit earlier, but does the method of plant reproduction tend to differ based on temperate versus tropical climate?
Not that I know. I'm not, but unfortunately, you're asking the wrong person. I'm not really that familiar with tropical trees. I don't see any reason why cloning seems so universal in the plant world that I have to believe that it's common everywhere. But I'd have to actually look on some websites that talk about that relative to tropical plants to be able to answer that question with any authority.
Okay. And then the other question was, I understand Native Americans would bend or train tree branches to direct a path. Is this correct?
Oh yes, I've forgotten there's a other than maybe it's marker tree. I thought there was another name for that. But trees are sort of plastic in their growth form. I mean, not many people would want a tree with a really weird growth form, but if you can train them when young, you just start to bend the tree over, and you keep bending it, and it will grow in a sort of loop form, or at least at a very sharp angle. And it will keep that form as long as the tree, at least the lower part of the tree, will keep that form. As soon as you stop training, it will start to grow up as a conventional tree of that species. But yes, you can train a tree into rather unusual growth forms.
A couple of folks in the chat suggested wayfaring tree or trail marker tree.
Trail marker,
Um,
I've heard all of those, yes. And no doubt people have, because trees are handy, and they're sort of plastic in the sense you can change their shape in a way. To do that, you can make rock cairns, if you don't have any trees nearby, but that's a way to make a permanent marker, having no highway signs to help people, sort of wayfinding markers you can put in a landscape without any roads and trails. Yeah, interesting question. So this is the form. Do you have another question?
No, I just said thank you. That's it. You can go.
Oh, this is the form you see Populus nigra today. We call it Lombardy poplars. They tend to live about 15 or 20 years, and then they die when planted in the Midwest. But they're a really quick visual screen. They grow super fast. You put lines of them one after the other, and it's sort of like just a tall fence. They're not very handsome when they start to fall apart, but they do create a very quick visual screen. But this is the tree that fastigiate form was, and it looks like a bur oak. It's just a big decurrent tree, spreads out widely, or like a big cottonwood open grown. And yet you can take that and create these fastigiate growth forms, again, creating that apical dominance that really suppresses the lateral buds. It doesn't completely stop them, but it inhibits their growth, and almost all the growth grows up instead of out. Here's the opposite. Here's a Norway spruce. This is typically trees widely planted around suburbs. It's probably, well, I hate to admit it, more hardy than our native white spruce when planted. Blue spruce is native out west. This one seems to probably do better in urban environments. And but this is what they've created out of that. They've created a Norway spruce that's lost almost all of its response to gravity. It's not growing up against gravity, and it just sprawls like a creeping shrub. This is called creeping or trailing Norway spruce. I remember the first one of these I found at the Morton Arboretum, which is a wonderful collection of conifers. I used to use that for teaching when I was there. And I admit I felt sorry for this tree when I saw it. It just seemed, I'm having more experience with trees in nature than in horticultural settings. I'm always a little disappointed when I see the native form change so dramatically. But this just shows how dramatically plants' response to the living world changes when you do these horticultural variations of it. This form we take for granted is actually the plant responding to the signals from the living world, gravity and sunlight. And here, when you take that response away, you get a totally different growth form. Thigmotropism, I normally think of it as the way vines twine around things. The vine comes up, it touches a structure, and then it responds by curling around that structure and using it as a support. But thigmotropism, the response to touch, is true of trees also. I used to see this all the time in North Woods, where I worked in the Huron Mountains of the Upper Peninsula, where late Pleistocene floods had deposited these large boulders in the uplands, and the hemlock seeds would germinate on top of the rock in a little crack in the sandstone, and the roots would go down into the sandstone, and then the roots would sort of creep along the outside all the way, and then they would grow down into the soil on the outside, and the hemlock tree would grow up off of that. So you'd have these, what would seem absurd situations of hemlock trees 100, 200 years old, big hemlock trees perched on, like they were sitting on top of these big rocks. But they can do this because the plant, in a sense, feels the rock and moves along its surface, exploring the cracks for water and nutrient absorption, and then eventually growing down into the tree. I think most of us have seen trees that are sort of fused together above ground. As the plant's growth is literally growing into one another. Here plants are growing around the branch, in this case of bald cypress growing around the branch. I mean, we can see that all the time. I mean, just, yes, it was 2 days ago, we were working in a place, there was Stickney Run, and we had a large mulberry tree that had swallowed up a fence. When you put an obstacle in the way of the tree, it senses that it's there, and then it just swallows it up and grows around it. In this case, barbed wire. Here it's swallowed up an entire fence. I mean, this almost looks like it must be CGI, you know, that they've done this in Hollywood. But no, when trees grow against something, they just grow around it and swallow it up. In this case, swallowing up these fence posts, here swallowing up an entire sign that was tacked onto the tree. So this is one way that trees just respond to the world around them and grow around or over their obstacles by sensing it and then growing around it.
What are you doing now, Tom?
I'm listening.
Listening for what?
I'm listening to the trees.
And why would you do that?
Well, this bur oak, last year it made a lot of acorns, not just this tree. All the bur oaks in Glacial Park made a lot of acorns. The year before they didn't make very many at all, and probably next year they won't make very many at all either. So they must be communicating, right? I mean, if sponge moths attack this tree, it will signal the trees around it to increase the tannin contents in their leaves to combat the sponge moth. So how do trees communicate?
It's a fascinating question that has garnered a lot of research in the last couple of decades, and the scientific papers on this get deep into the weeds really quickly, but I'll try to kind of give you a little bit of an overview to get some sense of what's happening out there. There are two predominant ways that plants are communicating with one another, and sometimes with other organisms of other species. And that's by volatile compounds that are produced by the above ground parts of plants, and by communication through common mycorrhizal networks. Here's that mycorrhizae, not just being an addition to the root system of an individual tree, but here knitting plants together, knitting trees together with plants, with herbaceous plants, into a common network, so that actually materials can move from one plant to another. So we have, volatile organic compounds. Sometimes it's abbreviated HIPV. A lot of abbreviations, a lot of acronyms in this field of science. Herbivore-induced plant volatiles, and then we have common mycorrhizal networks below ground. So here's a situation where a caterpillar is eating a leaf. The caterpillar, the saliva of the caterpillar, the oral secretions, frass meaning what moves through and is excreted by the caterpillar. All those have a particular molecular structure, and those patterns are recognized by the plant, which then produces chemical defenses against the larvae, the caterpillar that's feeding. So the plant is sensing the molecular patterns of the predator and producing chemical defenses to slow down the predator. The predator, on the other hand, is releasing what's called effectors. Believe it or not, effectors, and those are actually trying to trick the plant to lower its defenses. So, I mean, this is all going, when next time you see a caterpillar feeding on a plant, you have to imagine that both of these things are going on. The plant is responding to the feeding, it's producing chemicals that are trying to slow the caterpillar down. The caterpillar, on the other hand, is releasing chemicals that are trying to trick the plant into lowering its defenses. Hamps and effectors.
I had a question in the chat.
Okay.
So first part of the comment, love looking at craggy old trees, imagining their life. How do horticulturists create the tortured trees? Do they mix genes?
The tortured trees. Well, with I have to believe with something that's like Lombardy poplars, that this was long before genetic engineering, that we had Lombardy poplars. And so it has to be done by just selective breeding. If you look at populations, I mean, plant breeders are really hardworking people, and they're looking at thousands and thousands and thousands of specimens of a species and picking out things that are just a little bit more narrow in their growth form, the leaves that are slightly more red in color, and then breeding those with one another. And it's over generations creating these strikingly different plants that we see today. So, I mean, today there may be some genetic engineering been involved in creating some bizarre plant forms. I almost hate to think about what could be done with that, but most of it's done just as it was done. Just like ancient peoples took a grass and turned it into the weird genetic monstrosity we call corn today, plant breeders can take out of a population by selection, generation after generation after generation, create forms that seem dramatically different from the parent form. Okay. Okay, well, let's look at a different, now we have, instead of hamps, we have, I can't even say HIPV, herbivore-induced plant volatiles. So they're released from the upper parts of the plant, leaves, flowers, fruits, in response to herbivore attack. The HIPVs are directly attacking the insect pest, trying to stop the feeding and egg laying, but it also, see, these things are released into the atmosphere, and other insects take advantage of that. So predators of the larvae are then attracted by these same chemicals and then know to attack this plant, because this plant is releasing the chemical in response to being attacked by the insect larvae. The predators of the insect larvae are then attracted by the same chemical and then attack the insect larvae. So it's and it's apparently HIPVs also are interacting at a microorganismal level also with predators of plants. So this is a fascinating field of research. It's changing dramatically just over the last few years. This is a sponge. I said sponge moth in a little video. When I look online, it appears, and this is the new name for gypsy moth. I saw both sponge moth and spongy moth, but it seems the predominant name that's being used now is spongy moth. So I'll use spongy moth from now. I'll try to remember that. So oak tree spongy moth has been a real serious predator of oak trees throughout the eastern United States. It was in the 80s, it was spreading into the Midwest, and there were people saying this was the end of oaks in the Midwest. Spongy moths would just strip them all and they would die. And there was a lot of research going on. It's turned out that spongy moths have been serious, and locally they can be very serious and completely strip a tree of leaves, but they don't seem to have become epidemic. They tend to be localized. We have done some spraying of BT insecticide to try to slow them down, but we've been able to manage those, or oak trees have been able to manage those infestations. But in any event, when spongy moths attack an oak tree, they're generally attacking it in mass, and the oak tree is releasing volatile organic compounds, which are then signaling other parts of the same tree and other oak trees in the vicinity to increase the tannin contents in their leaves. The tannins slow down the growth of the spongy moths. Now, whether this is a response to the use of tannins by oak trees or not, the tannins that are then become a part of the caterpillar's body actually protect the caterpillar's body from the virus that kills the caterpillar. So hard to know exactly how all these things evolve, but as I said, this is really complicated when you start looking at this, but this is a good example of how an oak tree, a very common creature we're used to, is signaling other oak trees in response to attack by the spongy moths. Allelopathy is another form of communication. We may not think of it quite as much as communication, but it's sort of a natural herbicide. It's trying to keep other plants away from the plant that's producing the allelopathic chemicals. So allelopathy is the production of chemicals by one plant that suppresses the growth of other plants in the vicinity. The most common example of that we hear all the time is black walnut. Pretty well known that you don't plant your garden next to a black walnut tree. The juglone chemical produced in many parts of the black walnut tree suppresses the growth of many of our favorite garden plants. It probably does affect some native plants also, though when you look at a black walnut tree, you don't see a big circle of dirt under it. There seem to be a number of plants that can grow with a black walnut tree. It's known in at least high concentrations, it will suppress the growth even of other black walnut seedlings. So it may have an effect on suppressing some of the competitors of walnut trees. But we've some indication that the leaves of buckthorn, the leachate from a heavy deposition of buckthorn leaves can suppress the growth of some of the mycorrhizae that are symbiotic with oak trees. So there is another place where allelopathy may be playing a role in our woodlands today. This is corn. This is obviously not a tree, but so many of these things are first discovered herbaceous plants because that's where corn is of very great economic importance. And so there's a lot of research being done on corn. Most likely the things that plants, economically valuable plants, can do, the other plants like oak trees, birch trees, and basswood trees can do it also, and we just don't know it yet. It turns out that when corn leaves touch one another, they actually signal their roots to exude a chemical that suppresses the growth of the roots of other corn plants nearby, so creating a zone for this corn plant to grow with its roots relatively lower competition than it would be other sides. So here corn plants are communicating with other corn plants just from a sense of touch of other corn plant leaves. And they've done experiments where they touch the leaves with a probe, and they could stimulate this chemical release. So corn plants, some of the orderliness of corn plants' growth in a field is part of it's obviously where the plants are grown, but it's actually the plants are sort of talking to one another about, this is my space, it's not your space, keep your roots over there, buddy. I know I've read a number of sort of popular science articles in the last few years about sharing in the forest, and it's certainly true. Common mycorrhizal networks knit together lots and lots of different organisms. And if they knit together two trees and one tree is under extreme drought stress and the other one isn't, water will actually move from the tree that's better hydrated to the tree that's poorly hydrated. Likewise with these plants, nutrients can move back and forth between plants that are connected by common mycorrhizal networks. And we use the word sharing for that. I'll come back to that later. We have words like sharing and selfishness that are sort of, they're words we use for moral and immoral behavior amongst people, and we tend to use them loosely in referring to other creatures, maybe not always entirely appropriate. So we can have two trees growing near one another of completely different species. If one is under drought stress and the other one not. It can actually move water from one tree to another. But I think I already mentioned this, but the fungus isn't doing this for the good of the plants. The fungus is getting photosynthate, the sugars and other chemicals created in the plant the fungus can't make for itself are moved from the plant into the fungus, just as the fungus mycorrhizal network is allowing water and nutrients from the soil to move into the plant. Here you have plants that can actually, there are two trees, and water and nutrients can move back and forth between the two trees based on stresses in the two trees. And so the question is this really sharing? Is this altruism between plants as we think of altruism? I mean, I know, we've all been selfish at one time or another in our life. And there's a difference here. Selfish behaviors are those that benefit the self and harm another, and that violate an agreed upon moral code of conduct. So what I consider selfish behavior in my culture might not be considered selfish behavior in another human culture. It's possible anyway. But then other human culture, there's still would be things that are called selfish because there are ways in which I take a benefit for myself and harm another person. In evolutionary biology, you're really talking about what's self-interested behavior. And sometimes we use those words synonymously with human behavior, but in talking about plants and animals, are really very different. Self-interested behaviors are really behaviors that are benefiting the organisms, so it tends to increase the likelihood of reproduction or its fitness. Self-interested behaviors can be cooperative, like mycorrhizae in trees. I mean, those are very important cooperative relationship that's benefiting both, as in the common mycorrhizal network. And if the common mycorrhizal network, in knitting together all of these plants, I mean, it's a huge benefit to the pine tree. It's a huge benefit to the birch tree. It's a huge benefit to all the plants growing on the ground between it. The fact that water and nutrients move back and forth between trees and may at some point move out of my tree body to another tree body, and you might think, well, that's a disadvantage. But if the overall benefit is enormous, and any harm is small in relation, the common mycorrhizal network still serves an evolutionary benefit to the trees. The last question we're going to consider today is, do trees think? And this one goes back to my favorite movie again. Well, obviously this apple tree was thinking. I've met a number of people who really feel they can communicate with trees, and at some level I'm sure there was something going on, and I'm not going to pretend to either poo-poo that or endorse it one way or the other. But I want to, in all likelihood, trees don't think like us because they don't have a central nervous system. They don't have a brain. And if trees and other living things did think like us, I mean, if they were maybe not doing Tom Talks right now, but they were, chatting with one another and talking about the weather, and it's snowing outside and all that. It's been a warm winter. We have some snow again. They're actually doing that. The difference between us and the black walnut tree in my backyard, and the hackberry tree and the basswood tree I'm looking out the window right now, the difference would be superficial. We basically all be the same creature, only we just look different on the outside. Where that is really not true. The diversity of life, I mean, starting something like 4 billion years ago, from bacterial level all the way up to human beings and blue whales and algae growing in the ocean. It's an incredibly profound, deep and diverse, and it spans billions of years of history. There's no reason to think that we all think the same. I mean, what's true of all living things is that they sense the world around them. They're very much in contact with the world around them, and they respond to it in a variety of very interesting ways, just as we do. So in that sense, they think, if that's what you mean by thinking. I mean, we have bacteria and blue whales and giant redwood trees and those pesky little dandelions in our front yard. All of these are parts of the diversity of life. Each of them thinks, put that in quotes, in a way, in that it's taking in information from the outside world, it's responding to it, it's reproducing, it's growing. In that way, I mean, it's easy to see why people ask the question, but it doesn't really have a very satisfying answer. Human beings are in the company of billions, and I mean billions of fellow travelers, millions and millions of species of living things with us that are coming along with us in life. And it's the purpose of conservation to see that we bring along as many of them as we possibly can into the future. But we're also alone on our journey. We're also alone as a species, just as the redwood trees are alone, singular as a species. We all share a lot of resources, but we're alone as a species. Both of these things are true. And with that, thanks for coming along today on our journey.
I've got a couple of questions in the chat to get us started. If you want to ask questions, feel free to at the bottom of your screen. There's the chat icon. I think it used to be in the middle, but it moved over to the right hand side, so you can type in there, or you can unmute and ask your question. So the first question from the chat was back at the corn plant picture.
Yes.
How does the exuding corn plant keep its own roots from being suppressed?
Well, one would guess that that's a good question. I would guess the answer to that question is probably highly technical, but the chemicals released by one plant are suppressing the growth of the roots of another plant without the chemicals are released by the roots themselves. So whether they're individual, markers in each individual plant that recognizes its own chemicals and not the other one, I don't know the answer to that question. It's a good question. I could forward you the article if you want to leave your email address, and can guarantee it would be a very complicated answer.
And then a question about would Native Americans moving into glaciated landscapes be motivated to carry acorns and hickory nuts with them for future generations? Hundreds of miles of dispersal would be possible in a year.
That's a wonderful. I'm glad someone said that, because that's been one of those questions about what seems to be a very rapid migration of trees at the close of the Ice Age. I mean, it's true of a lot of species, not just oak trees and hickory nuts. What role did human have in that? Human beings are, all these points are contentious because we don't have a time machine. Human beings are probably spreading across North America around the same time, 12,000 years ago, maybe 13,000 years ago. And they seem to spread to the far corners of North and South America very rapidly, at least the first, just the stuff I've read over the years, the first fossil evidence of their presence occurs in geographically widely separated areas all over North and South America. So could they have been here before that? I don't know, but at least the conservative anthropologists are saying they're coming in here around that same time, the close of the Ice Age. Could they have been involved in that transport northward? I mean, anything is possible. There are another, maybe more likely answer is that something that Margaret Davis wasn't thinking about. She was thinking about an overall migration of all the plants southward in the Ice Age, in the peak of the cold climate periods, and then the movement of the populations northward as the climate warmed. It could be that what happened was that those northward populations of oaks really didn't disappear entirely. They were just really shrunk down into very small little refugia that were just by their topography protected somewhat from the peak of the cold. And so there were little outliers of white oak and bur oak and all that pretty far north of the main populations. And so, but they produce very little pollen, and so it doesn't show up in the fossil pollen record until the populations get larger. And so the populations really didn't have to migrate in a straight line hundreds of miles, that rather they were spreading out from a lot of smaller centers that were further north. So there are a couple of different hypotheses. It's hard to imagine, oak trees spreading. I love math, but I didn't work it out. If you're spreading 15 miles a century and you do that 15 miles, so you're spreading, that's 3 miles. That's 3 miles per generation. That's a long way to do consistently every generation, 3 miles, another 3 miles, another 3 miles, marching northward. So the odds are people certainly played a role in the dispersal of plants. That there's no question that people played a role in the post-glacial dispersal of plants. How big a role did they play? How much of that dispersal was simply dispersal from small population centers north of the main population that simply didn't show up in the fossil pollen record? How much were animals involved in those movements? There's a lot of interesting questions there. We just don't have really, perfect answers for them at this time. That's a good question.
There's a question on how did your acorn collection project go?
It went very well, and I did put in more acorn planting experiments in our fall weekend of restoration. I've cold stratified some in my refrigerator in the area near my office, and I'll be planting those this spring in our weekend of restoration. They already have big root radicals sticking out, but you can keep them alive over winter in wet sand, and they'll be planted this spring. So it's all a part of, these are experiments in our ability to direct seed and produce more oak trees. Do we have to buy seedlings, or can we actually propagate oaks by gathering acorns and planting them in the ground? And that's what all this was a part of. So yes, we planted lots of them last fall. We'll be planting more of them this spring.
There's a comment, NAI used large sheets of bark from oaks for shelters, so it suggests they were already there in size. Wondering if that's going back to the acorns being carried question. If others have questions, we still got about 5 minutes left. We're happy to continue taking questions. So far, I've read everything that's in the chat, but I'm kind of stalling for a moment in case anybody is typing.
Well, what I would like to ask people is that, I have a long-standing love affair with trees. That was when I first became a naturalist in my head, was my first Audubon's Guide to the Trees of the Eastern United States, and identifying my first tree. And that's where it all started. I love trees. I like talking about them. If there are other things, I've thought of some other topics related to trees, not just trees, obviously, but since we were talking about trees today, if you can think of other things related to trees, I could be, focused on particular groups of trees like oaks, or thought of a topic that I've sort of know a bit about and have done some work in the past, about human uses of trees going back really thousands of years. We think about ancient cultures and stone buildings because the stones are what lasted, but basically they were almost all of them wood cultures, and the use of trees and how those traditional uses of trees have sort of evolved and changed over time, and how we use wood and all those. It's fascinating to me because I've enjoyed woodworking in the past, but those are all anything related to trees and other things. We're always looking for new topics for Tom Talks. I like to choose topics that I have a foothold in, but that I have something important to learn about also. I like to learn each time I do one of these Tom Talks, and you guys have not let me down yet, so keep those cards and letters coming.
I had a question. Could you comment on swamp white oaks in McHenry County? Are they common?
Swamp white oaks are very rare in McHenry County. As far as I know, we only have 2 locations for them. Oddly, while they're relatively common as you go east along the Des Plaines River, swamp white oaks are not unusual. As you go west, they drop out. We still haven't, as far as I know, located a single one in the eastern part of McHenry County. They show up in the western part of the Marengo Moraine. We have 2 populations there that are not far from one another that look like naturally occurring populations. There's not a house nearby or any evidence or likelihood that anyone planted them there. So they're very rare in McHenry County, somewhat more common in Lake County and along the Des Plaines River, lowlands and flatwoods. In fact, I live in Lake County, to where I take my dog for a walk at Old School Forest Preserve. We walk past swamp white oaks every time we go there, but they're pretty rare in McHenry County.
Great. Well, that is all of the questions that are in the chat. I do want to point out, this is the last of our Tom Talks for a bit. We don't have any scheduled yet, and we're probably going to take a break over the upcoming spring and summer field season.
I'm shedding a tear right now, but
So if you have ideas for topics and things, we'll kind of collect them throughout the year, and we'll probably do a couple more in the winter time. So we really appreciate you coming. I'll pass it back to Tom for any parting remarks.
no, I want to just thank everyone for coming today. These are Tom Talks have been really a discovery of the last few years. It started in the pandemic because that was the only way to reach people, but they've continued to be fun for me. So I want to keep doing it as long as we can keep an audience, and as long as you can keep coming up with good topics for us, we'll keep it going.
Thank you all. Have a great
Thank
day.
you. Goodbye.